Let's talk about one of the most epic blockbusters of all time. I'm talking about a story with a cast of millions, jaw-dropping special effects, and a hero's journey that has shaped the world for thousands of years. You've got a nation of slaves, a series of 10 catastrophic plagues, blood, frogs, boils, you name it, and a final dramatic escape where the very sea parts to let them through. I mean, Cecil B. DeMille, eat your heart out. This is the story of the Exodus. It's a cornerstone for three major world religions. But what if I told you that for a story of this magnitude, the historical and archaeological record is completely silent? What if this epic story, the one with millions of people leaving a trail from Egypt to Canaan, left behind less evidence than I do after a weekend camping trip? That's what we're digging into today. Because the evidence suggests the Exodus isn't just an exaggeration, it never happened at all. All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty. This is where the story starts to unravel. The first place you'd look for evidence of a massive historical event is in the historical records, right? And when it comes to the ancient world, the Egyptians were the undisputed champions of writing stuff down. These guys were meticulous. They carved their history onto temple walls. They wrote on papyrus. They recorded everything. Grain harvests, tax receipts, diplomatic letters, military campaigns, even complaints from workers about their daily beer rations. Seriously, we have a mountain of their records. Now, let's look at the biblical numbers for the Exodus. The book of Exodus itself says there were 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. If you do the math, that's a total population of somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. Let me put that in perspective for you. The best estimates for the entire population of Egypt during the New Kingdom, the period when the Exodus is supposed to have happened, is somewhere around 3 to 4.5 million people. So we're talking about an event where potentially half of the country's population, its entire slave labor force according to the story, just gets up and walks out of the country in a single night. This wouldn't just be a minor inconvenience. This would be a civilization-shattering, apocalyptic event. The Egyptian economy would have instantly collapsed. Their military would have been crippled. It would have been the single most significant event in Egyptian history. And what do we find in their extensive, detailed, and frankly obsessive records? Nothing. Not a single carving, not one piece of papyrus, not a word about an Israelite slave population of that size, not a word about 10 devastating plagues, nothing about their entire workforce vanishing, nothing about the Pharaoh's army being drowned in the sea. It's just crickets. We have Egyptian border control records from the period like the Papyrus Anastasia 5 that mention tracking down 2 runaway slaves. They wrote that down, but 2 million people? Not worth a footnote. Therefore, the immediate response from believers is always the same. Well, of course they didn't write it down. Pharaohs would never record their own embarrassing defeats. It sounds like a decent argument on the surface, a get-out-of-jail-free card for the lack of evidence. But does it actually hold up to scrutiny? Let's take a look. Okay, so let's tackle that head-on. The idea that pharaohs were too proud, too arrogant to ever admit a defeat. It sounds good, right? It fits the whole all-powerful pharaoh image we have in our heads. But here's the thing. It's just not true at all. Pharaohs and their scribes weren't in the business of ignoring bad news. They were in the business of propaganda. They were masters of spin. Think of them as the original political spin doctors. They didn't hide their failures. They rebranded them as glorious victories. And we have a perfect, rock-solid example of this. Let me introduce you to the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE between Pharaoh Ramses II, often called Ramses the Great, and the Hittite Empire. Now, by any sane, objective historical measure, this battle was a complete disaster for Ramses. He got overconfident, marched his troops straight into a brilliant Hittite ambush, and got cut off from the rest of his army. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and nearly killed. He basically survived by the skin of his teeth. So when he gets back to Egypt, does he pretend it never happened? Does he tell his scribes, hey, let's just, not mention that whole near-death experience thing? Nope. He does the exact opposite. He commissions gigantic, breathtaking reliefs on the walls of the most important temples in Egypt, at Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesseum. And what do these carvings show? They show Ramses as a superhero. He's depicted as being 10 feet tall, single-handedly charging the enemy in his chariot, scattering thousands of Hittite soldiers like bowling pins. The official story became that his personal bravery alone won the day. He turned a near-catastrophic military blunder into his most celebrated personal triumph. That's not hiding a defeat. That's turning a defeat into the centerpiece of your PR campaign. So even if the Exodus had happened and the Egyptians saw it as a national humiliation, we wouldn't expect to find silence. We'd expect to find a massive temple inscription saying something like, "The great Pharaoh in his infinite wisdom magnanimously decided to expel the ungrateful foreign rabble from our sacred lands to purify Egypt." They would have spun it. The one thing they wouldn't do is pretend millions of people just vanished into thin air without a trace. The silence is the problem. But okay, let's play devil's advocate. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that this one event was so traumatic, so embarrassing, that every scribe in Egypt made a pact of silence and took the secret to their graves. Fine. Forget the written records. Surely, a group of 2 million people wandering around the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years must have left something behind, right? A pot, a tool, a single campsite. Okay, so let's move on from the written records and talk about physical evidence. We're talking about archaeology. This is where the story goes from unbelievable to physically impossible. The Bible says the Israelites wandered the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. Let that sink in. 40 years. Now, if you're going to search for ancient remains, the Sinai Desert is one of the best places on Earth to do it. It's incredibly arid and sparsely populated, which means that artifacts that would normally decay and disappear can be preserved for thousands of years. It's an archaeologist's dream. And we know this because we've found things there from that exact time period, the Late Bronze Age. Teams of archaeologists have surveyed the Sinai for decades. We found seasonal campsites from small groups of Semitic miners who were sent there by the Egyptians to mine for turquoise and copper. We found their pottery, their stone tools, their inscriptions, even some of their religious shrines. So we know, without a doubt, that even the faintest traces of human activity can survive in the Sinai. Now, picture 2 million people, the entire population of Houston, Texas, living in this desert for 40 years. Imagine the sheer amount of stuff they would leave behind. We're talking about millions and millions of broken pottery shards. We're talking about countless campfires and cooking pits. We're talking about discarded tools and weapons. Most importantly, we're talking about the dead. Over 40 years, a population of 2 million people would have left behind hundreds of thousands, if not millions of graves. We're talking about a massive, undeniable archaeological footprint. And after decades of searching, what have we found? Nothing. Not a single piece of Israelite pottery. Not one campsite that can be linked to them. Not one burial site. It's a complete and total archaeological void. The most famous and respected archaeologists in the field, people like Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, have stated this unequivocally. He wrote, and I quote, "The conclusion that the Exodus did not happen as described in the Bible seems irresistible. Repeated excavations and surveys in the entire area have not provided the slightest evidence. Therefore, if they weren't in Egypt and they weren't in the Sinai, the whole next part of the story, the bloody, swift military conquest of Canaan, starts to look pretty shaky too." So after 40 years of apparently leaving no trace, the Bible says the Israelites, now a battle-hardened army led by Joshua, finally reach the Promised Land. And what's the first thing they do? Launch a massive, bloody military campaign to conquer it. The book of Joshua is basically a highlight reel of this supposed conquest, with city after city falling to the invading Israelite forces. It's dramatic, it's epic, and according to archaeology, it's a complete fiction. Let's start with the big one, the Battle of Jericho. This is probably one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. Joshua and his army march around the heavily fortified city for 7 days, they blow their trumpets, and the massive walls just collapse. It's a miracle. The only problem, when archaeologists like Kathleen Kenyon excavated the site of ancient Jericho, they discovered that during the late Bronze Age, the time Joshua was supposed to be there, around 1250 BCE, Jericho was a small, poor settlement with no walls. In fact, it might not have even been occupied at all. The massive walls that people talk about had been destroyed centuries earlier and were ancient ruins by the time Joshua allegedly showed up. So there were no walls to come a-tumbling down. And this isn't a one-off. The Bible gives a very detailed account of the capture of the city of Ai. But again, archaeology tells a different story. The site identified as Ai was a desolate ruin for over 1,000 years before the Israelites were supposed to have arrived. It's like boasting that you conquered a ghost town. The pattern continues across Canaan. Most of the cities the Bible claims were violently conquered by the Israelites show no archaeological evidence of destruction from that time. Instead, they show signs of gradual cultural change or peaceful transition. There's no evidence of a massive, unified invading army sweeping through the land. The conquest, as the Bible describes it, simply never happened. But this raises a huge question. If the evidence shows the Israelites didn't come from Egypt, didn't wander the Sinai, and didn't conquer Canaan from the outside, where on earth did they come from? Well, archaeology has a much better and far more interesting answer. So if the Israelites didn't come from Egypt and didn't invade from the outside, where did they come from? The answer, it turns out, is that the Israelites were an inside job. This is what's known as the gradual emergence theory, and it's the overwhelming consensus among mainstream historians and archaeologists today. The theory is simple. The first Israelites weren't invaders. They were native Canaanites. They were a collection of local folks, probably a mix of pastoralists, peasants, and maybe some social outcasts who moved into the sparsely populated central hill country of Canaan to start a new life away from the powerful and oppressive city-states on the coast. Think of it less like a foreign military invasion and more like a social and religious revolution. These groups gradually developed their own unique culture and identity. But when you look at the early settlements, everything about them is Canaanite. Their pottery styles are Canaanite. Their house architecture is Canaanite. Their language, Hebrew, is a Canaanite dialect. There's a clear continuity with the local culture. There's no sign of a foreign group suddenly appearing. And here's the kicker. This is the smoking gun. The very first time the name Israel appears in any historical record is on a giant slab of stone carved by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, dated to about 1208 BCE. It's a victory monument where Merneptah boasts about his military campaign in Canaan. He lists all the peoples he conquered, and right there, clear as day, is the line, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more." Now, notice what this tells us. The first time we ever hear about Israel, they are already living inside Canaan. They're not slaves in Egypt, they're not wandering in the desert, they are an established people in the hill country, significant enough for a pharaoh to brag about defeating them. This one artifact completely flips the biblical timeline on its head. It shows that the people of Israel were already home long before their supposed escape. Therefore, we get to the final, most important question. If the Exodus didn't happen, why make it up? Why would a group of people invent a national origin story about being slaves in a foreign land? What was the point? So this brings us to the final and most important question. If the Exodus is a myth, why was it written? Why would a group of people whose ancestors were already living in Canaan invent a national origin story about being slaves in Egypt? The answer is that the Exodus story isn't a historical account, it's a political manifesto. It's one of the most brilliant pieces of nation-building propaganda ever written. Most scholars believe the story as we know it was compiled and written down much later than the events it describes, probably around the 7th century BCE. This was a crucial time for the tiny kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel had already been wiped out by the Assyrian Empire, and Judah was a small, vulnerable state caught between two superpowers,
Egypt to the south, and Assyria, Babylon to the northeast. The king of Judah at the time, a guy named Josiah, was trying to do something radical. He wanted to centralize power, create a strong national identity, and declare Judah's independence from these massive empires. But how do you take a bunch of disparate hill tribes and convince them they are one unified people with a special destiny? You give them an epic origin story. The Exodus myth was the perfect tool for the job. Think about what it accomplishes. It creates a shared identity. You're not just a collection of different clans from different hills. No, you are all the descendants of people who suffered together as slaves in Egypt and were miraculously freed. It's a shared trauma and a shared triumph that binds everyone together as a single nation. It establishes their God as supreme. Your national God Yahweh isn't just some local deity. He's the God who single-handedly defeated the most powerful empire on earth, Egypt, and humiliated their entire pantheon of gods. It's a theological power move that says our God is the only one that matters. And it provides a divine law. The story includes the trip to Mount Sinai, where Moses supposedly receives the 10 Commandments directly from God. This gives the kingdom's laws a divine stamp of approval. It's not just the king's law, it's God's law. The Exodus story isn't about what happened hundreds of years ago. It's about the political and religious needs of Judah in the 7th century BCE. It's a declaration of independence that says we are a unique people with a unique God and a unique destiny. It's not failed history, it's incredibly successful mythology. So there you have it. The silence of the Egyptians, the emptiness of the Sinai, and the archaeological truth of Canaan all point to one conclusion. The Exodus as described in the Bible didn't happen. It's a powerful foundational myth created to forge a nation, and understanding why it was written, I think, is far more fascinating than clinging to a story that has no basis in reality. But what do you think? Is the story less powerful if it isn't literally true? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed digging into the facts behind the fables, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep thinking. I'm Farid, and I'll see you in the next one.